Well, a key element in the budget plan to start trimming the deficit is the proposal to freeze public sector wages. Non-unionized staff, about 350,000 of them, now face a 2-year compensation freeze for those who bargain collectively. The government is simply refusing to fund any increases. To talk more about the implications, I'm joined by Fred Hahn, who's president of CUPE Ontario, and Kevin Gaudette, who's the director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Welcome to the program, both of you.
Thank you.
Mr. Hahn, you represent not only the biggest public sector union, but the biggest union in the province. You've got provincial, municipal, social service agencies. What do you make of this concept? Can you make it work?
Well, the reality is it's not good for the economy. At the end of the day, what this will mean is service cuts in communities. It will mean that there'll be less money circulating in the economy. And, you know, this budget was supposed to be about how we fixed the economy of the province of Ontario. And it's patently unfair to have workers, many of whom are modestly paid, most of whom are women, have to pay for, at the end of the day, the other part of this budget was a corporate tax cut that provided $4.6 billion out of public coffers to corporations. So we think that's unfair.
Well, explain to me how it translates into service cuts, though, because if it's just a wage freeze, I mean, lots of people have freezes now. They're not talking about layoffs.
There are
Why not
many
accept
parts,
freezes? There
are many parts of the budget in healthcare alone. The O.T.S.A. actually said that if there wasn't a 2% increase in hospital funds, that there would have to be cuts in service. This budget contained 1.5% in transfers to hospitals. That will translate absolutely into service cuts. And there's this fallacy that the public sector has not been suffering in the recession. We've got layoff notices not only at hospitals, but at associations for community living, at children's aid societies. There are childcare centres that are threatening to close or are actually closing in municipalities. These are real jobs in real communities.
Mr. Gaudette, what do you make of the government's plan to try to freeze wages? Do you think it can work? Think it could be effective?
Well, I'm not convinced they're actually going to get it done. I'm not sure when many of these contracts are probably not even open for negotiation for 2 or 3 more years. The government has a good history of negotiating labour agreements that don't come up until after the next election, so no labour strife occurs prior to an election. But
there are some. I mean, Mr. Hahn will tell you there's some coming up this year, some coming up nurses next year, I think.
Before the election?
Before the election, yeah.
Great. Well, we'll see whether or not they keep their word then. Still another budget away before that election. Look, I think that the government, it's one of the few measures that the government put in place that I think merits some support. The fact is that the Sunshine List came out recently, and we're looking at just under 64,000 employees in Ontario who earn in excess of $100,000. Keeping in mind the average Ontarian only makes $74,000, not to mention that most of these Ontario employees enjoy pensions, whereas 2/3 of Ontarians don't. And if the government has the government does have a $21 billion deficit, which is going to go on for some 7 years, somehow the government has to get the spending under control. So this is going to have to be one of the places that they look at.
Okay, you heard Mr. Hahn. He's saying that a lot of the people who touched to this are people who aren't on the Sunshine List and maybe work in social service agencies. And on the other hand, we've got a corporate tax cut that's happening at the same time. How do you square that?
Well, I think the fact just is when governments have large deficits and they're looking to balance budgets over time, that they're difficult decisions to make across the board. They're either going to have to cut spending and or increase taxes. My organization, the Taxpayers Federation, argues that as 47% average tax burden in Ontario is already sufficiently large, we're looking at a myriad of tax increases already that they're going to be facing, so the government needs to get spending down, and I think that's the way it has to go, and Ontarians are going to have to learn to expect less from their government.
Mr. Hahn, just in a collective bargaining way for the people you represent, it's going to be this indirect kind of attempt to impose a wage freeze by not funding any increases. How will that work out at the bargaining table? Can that work at the bargaining table? Can they come together and say, okay, we're only funded for this, let's just accept zeros and let's have a contract for 2 years? And
this isn't the first time that public sector workers have faced challenging bargaining when governments have, said that there isn't resources available for bargaining. Look, the reality is, if we want to talk about our average wage in CUPE is $35,000 a year. These are not overly paid workers. Every dollar our members make goes back into their local communities, into the grocery stores and the gas stations, making sure that small businesses and communities exist. The reality is, if we want to talk about the Sunshine List, we want to talk about hospital CEOs who are making $800,000 a year. We should talk about that. If we want to talk about the government's plans to actually encourage these CEOs to get bonuses if they lay off workers and build in efficiencies, we should be talking about that, because that doesn't make any sense.
But it's getting to the point of the bargaining, though. Can you accept zeros? I mean, under the circumstances, I mean, lots of places are getting layoffs. You potentially can maybe avoid layoffs by to clicking zeros for a couple of years and keep your jobs.
The reality is that our members are going to go to the bargaining table and they're going to do their very best to bargain good collective agreements for people. But at the end of the day, what we should be looking at is the bigger economic impact this is going to have in our communities. There are communities devastated by job losses. We all know about them. And we know that in many of those communities, if it wasn't for the school and the municipality and the hospital and those jobs and those dollars in those communities, that small businesses wouldn't survive, that those dollars are helping those local communities to survive. At the end of the day, every dollar that's circulating in the economy is important. We've got a provincial budget that not only will restrict money in the public sector that for public services that are more needed, but actually takes money away from us all to pay for services that we need by giving a corporate tax cut that at the end of the day has no strings tied to it to invest in the province, to generate jobs.
Let Mr. Gaudette get in on the corporate tax cut side, because this has been raised by Mr. Hahn, by the NDP. I mean, times are tough. We got Mr. Ignatieff on the federal side, maybe suggesting we should back off on corporate tax cuts. Should we maybe back off on them in the name of getting the fiscal house in order?
It's actually, there haven't been tax reductions on the corporate side for ages in Ontario. The marginal effective tax rates in Ontario have made Ontario businesses, importantly, non-competitive. We're seeing jurisdictions around Ontario, surrounding Ontario, having lower tax rates, which is a disincentive to draw venture capital and new business to Ontario. So it's actually a good move by the government to, in fact, move towards the reduction of the corporate tax rate. We're glad to see that.
Can we afford it now, though?
The reality is we have a lower tax rate, a lower corporate tax rate than we have at the federal level. At the federal level, they're already acknowledging, look, we need these resources in public coffers in order to be able to provide services that people need.
Okay, can we afford those? Can we afford it right now, though?
The Laffer curve research shows that when you reduce corporate tax rates, that actually total revenue actually increases. So there won't be a cost to the Treasury. It's an argument that doesn't hunt.
That's trickle-down economics from the states. The reality is there's $4.6 billion of money that would have been in public coffers for healthcare, for education, for social services. We know unemployment in the province is high. People are going to be leaving unemployment rolls and going on social assistance. We need to be able to pay for these things.
Maybe we
should
the reality of the car companies $4 billion last year. Where were you on that one?
Hey, look, government needs to be able, in an economic crisis that none of us caused, to be able to save jobs in communities.
So corporate subsidies are okay, but corporate tax cuts aren't. That strikes me as very arbitrary.
Look, the reality is, if you want to stimulate the economy, why wouldn't you give incentives to business to say, look, if you invest in this community, if you invest in innovation and productivity, if you create jobs, we'll give you a tax credit.
Okay, let's just try to for 40 seconds left. And one note to you, Mr. Gaudette, if I could. You mentioned the Sunshine List, and Mr. Hahn brought up the hospital CEOs. 30 seconds left. Should they go after at least as a symbolic way, go after some of the higher paid people in the civil service?
Excuse me. I think that it will be important to change actually how we pay our senior executives. They should be less salary-driven and more, in fact, performance-driven, so that we can compensate them based on performance, whether or not that's, it's not revenue-driven, but it could be cost-driven, it could be performance-driven, it could be cost per patient-driven. The number of metrics we could put in place to incentivize them differently instead of salary-drive it.
Okay, well, we have to leave it there. There's always more to talk about, but thank you both, Fred Hahn, Kevin Gaudette.
Thanks.
Thank you.
And still ahead in our final segment, your comments and the play of the week. Giving the hook.